interested in when I moved to the East Coast, because there's so much colonial history, as you know, in the Philadelphia area and south central Pennsylvania, that I got interested in poking around as to how we got here as Lutherans. It's growing up in the Midwest, I always thought, well, we just parachuted in, right, to Wisconsin or Minnesota or someplace like that. But it turns out it was a far more complicated process than that. So what I'm going to do today is take a look at not only how we got here, but also where we're headed. Because very much the same questions that were being asked in 1740 are still being asked 350 or 250 years later. And I think that's some important learning for us as we go forward. But it is very important to know and to never forget that the first Lutherans flew the blue and yellow. They brought the svensk, right? We forget that. It was Swedes initially who arrived in the New World, somewhere between mid-17th century, 1635 to about 1655. And they landed in what we know now as Delaware. And these were the settlements all up and down the river. They had an easy access to the area through the Chesapeake Bay and up the Delaware River. So mostly, if you know anything about that area, the Swedes were in mostly Wilmington, Delaware area, up into the southern part of Philadelphia. Now, why don't we consider the Swedes as the first Lutherans in the U.S.? Mostly for two reasons. One is they were far more interested in commerce than they were in settlement. And that's important to know. Because you're not going to start churches if you're not going to live there. The Swedes were far more interested in being merchants, in traveling up and down the river, seeing what they could get from this new world, but didn't have a whole lot of interest in staying. So, nonetheless, you'll see, especially in that lower box there, that little square, that's where they landed. And so they had all sorts of stuff going on up and down the river. There were also, much to their chagrin, there were some Finns there too. but mostly, you've got Nya Stockholm, Christiana, which eventually became Wilmington. So you've got all these Swedish settlements. And even until today, you can see the Swedish influence, but it's very narrowly located right along this area. And if you go to this part of Philadelphia, if you ever get out there, there's a beautiful Swedish American Society building and kind of museum, and they do a lot of events during the year. So the impact of the Swedish settlement is still there, but it didn't last very long, and it wasn't nearly what the Germans had done, which we're going to see in just a moment. Oh, and there were some Dutch also, because remember, what was the first name of New York City?
New Amsterdam.
New Amsterdam, exactly. And the Dutch, too, weren't terribly interested in settling way up here. They wanted the merchandise. They wanted the stuff that they could get from the area, but they always intended to go back to where they were. But they did build a few churches. And I put these up on purpose because, how many have been to Sweden? Anybody? Right. Do those churches look familiar? Yeah. They did, and I told you, they still have an influence in their architecture. You will see as you go up and down that corridor that I just showed you that as they planted these churches, it's not like they reinvented church architecture. They brought with them what they knew. Now, does that church look anything like any of the churches around here? Absolutely. Yeah, you see them around. I mean, even First Lutheran down the hill is kind of reminiscent of what you've got going on down there. So one of the ways that the early Lutherans in this country made an impact, and a lasting impact, was not so much with their bodies, it was with their architecture. The church on the left is Old Swedes Church in Philadelphia. The church on the right is Old Swedes Church in Wilmington. So they are kind of the bookends of Lutheran settlements in the early New World. Now, where did they go? Okay, we're still with the Swedes. Yes, red means concentration. Okay? Do you see anything? Do you see anything there in a little bend in the Mississippi River? Do you see that? Right? That's what happened to them. So they didn't, right? They didn't stop much in Pennsylvania. A little bit up if you've been to Maine, right? A lot of Swedish settlements in Maine, a lot of Swedish Lutheran churches up there. If you've been to this part of Pennsylvania, still the same thing. Why this, strangely enough, why this part of Pennsylvania? Do you know?
Erie Canal?
Yeah, exactly. They were able to travel through the St. Lawrence Seaway and a little bit more interior rather than having to take, the wagons from where they were when they eventually moved. So I just want to point out one or two things in terms of Lutheran movement and immigration. Why isn't this area more red? No. The Norwegians. Right? So there's something important to know about this and this. The Norwegians who came to Wisconsin, if you've ever been up here, and I know some of you have, this is not great farm country, which the Norwegians were fine with, because Norway isn't great farm country. But this is all timber. So the Norwegians came and ended up working the timber, much of which went down the river to places like this little red spot, and even further down to build really much of what happened in the 19th century. This stuff, however, if you've been up here and up here, this stuff really offers two things that Swedes could do. And do you know what those things were?
Farming.
Skiing. One was farming, right? And what was the other? Ore. This is the ore range of Upper Michigan. Now, why is that important? One of the things that we have to remember about our Lutheran Church, I'm going to speak to that in just a moment. We are much more intricately woven into the settling of this country than we think we were. And that's important for us to remember. We don't have a huge footprint religiously, okay, in terms of percentage of population. You're going to see a map that explains that in just a moment. But we are disproportionately impacting the growth of this country in terms of what Lutherans are doing. We're mining the ore, okay, which eventually goes through the Great Lakes and lands in places like this, where there are some other Swedes. And you know what that ore turned into? Steel. Exactly. And you know what that steel turned into? Everything. Right. Brooklyn Bridge, Stanford, Golden Gate Bridge, skyscrapers in the major cities. Wow. We had a connection to that. We had a strong connection to that. Because it was Swedish Lutherans, Finnish Lutherans, Norwegian Lutherans, all up here who were using the resources, who were mining, farming, cutting timber, and making sure that the rest of all of this got built up.
Plows.
Okay. What's that?
Plows.
And plows, right. Some of that steel went into plows. Where? All right. Oh, I don't want to forget this. Little Swedish kids going to Sunday school, right? Sure. That is an important picture because now we're going to move towards the Germans and down from the Swedes. This picture is from 1910. Do you know what 1910 was in this country in terms of Swedes? It was the peak. It was the most. Do you know when Trinity Lutheran Church was founded?
12, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This migration has a direct impact on Trinity. This congregation was built, and part of our lore here, part of our origin story is about English, right? And speaking English, and that is a part of it. But a big part of it is, in 1910, we needed more churches. In 1912, in 1915, we needed more churches. Because people were moving in, expanding, in this case, coming up the hill, right? So we needed to plant churches. And remember those two words, plant churches, because we're about to move on to the Germans. After 1910, Swedish kind of immigration and population began a steep decline. This is a little bit hard to read. It wasn't a great resolution when I expanded it. But now I want to move to the Germans, because the Germans really were the ones who were seen as, in terms of Lutherans, the settlers of this country, especially in the 18th and early 19th century. It was the Germans who came to stay. Why did they come to stay? They primarily came to stay because A, Germany was full. There was not, Germany hasn't grown much since those days. There was not a lot of space. But the other thing was poverty and persecution. Typically when you talk about immigrants, is it the wealthiest people from a society who are the immigrants?
No.
No, almost never. It's the people at the bottom. It's the folks who either don't have the land, don't own the land, don't have a lot of prospects. So they picked up a lot of them and came over here and ended up primarily in Pennsylvania to start, because there was all of those things were accessible. All of those things were going to be possible in the New World and not the Old. But we should disavow ourselves of the notion that this was the bright and shining shore for those immigrants. This was very unpleasant. Pennsylvania soil, I will tell you, in the places where they first settled, is rocky. It is somewhat hilly, not too bad. It is not easy to farm, and it was strongly wooded. It was not easy to farm. And, for the most part, they brought their religion with them, but couldn't afford to send for and pay a pastor. Not much has changed. Because one of the big, and I'm going to get to that in a minute, because one of the biggest challenges we have today, the reason we have 35 open churches in this synod alone, and that's not unusual across the country. The reason we have so many open churches, for the most part, is people being able to afford a pastor. So, history kind of loops back and comes back around. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Enter the Muhlenbergs. Henry Muhlenberg, who came to this country in 1741, he was in his mid-20s. He was one of the people who was asked by his bishop in Germany, go to the New World, go to America, find out if all of these letters that we're getting are actually true. Find out if these people really do need pastors. So he travels over, like I said, he's in his mid-20s, he comes over, he looks around, and he realizes two things. One is, yes, there are virtually no pastors in the New World. So we've got to send people over. The second that he discovered, and we might laugh because of some of the assumptions we make about Germans, the churches were incredibly unorganized, disorganized. They were all over the place. And it was a real mess. There were no synods, there were no conferences, there were no collegial relationships. There was just churches that had popped up. Most of them were called union churches. Do you know what union churches are? Union churches are very popular in the East. Even still, there are still some. My first call was a union church. It was Lutherans and German Reformed. Now we would call the UCC. Lutherans and German Reformed, out in the hinterlands, this they were smart about. Why would we build two churches when we could build one? So they would have their different services. Much of it would be separate. But because they had similar faith history, similar location history, they said, hey, let's build one church, all those stones out of the field, and build another. Interestingly enough, I wouldn't be surprised if we start going back to that in the future. As people also, not just pastors, but as people also start to struggle to afford their buildings. That congregations might start again sharing their buildings to cut down on costs and have a smaller footprint. But here's Henry's kids, and we'll get into some of those in just a little bit, especially Peter, Frederick, and Ernst. In those days, you could be both a Lutheran and an Anglican at the same time. Do you know why? This is critical for understanding the American Revolution. What's critical about it is, at the time of the American Revolution, the German king was a liege of King George in England. So really, England was running Germany. Now, why is that important? Well, in part because of this. You could be in the Church of England and the Lutheran Church at the same time because there was that relationship. But the other reason that it plays in is we're going to talk a little bit about the immigrant status of Lutherans, because we were not always looked at as real great. Primarily because there was always a question about whether the German Lutherans were on the side of the Patriots or on the side of the English. Because their loyalties, even though they lived in this country, they were still under the seal of the king in England. This puts an entirely different spin on the Hessians. We think the Hessians were these mercenaries, right? And they were to some extent. But the Hessians were also impressed into service by the English, whether they wanted to or not, because they were subjects of the king. And so as Lutherans, we had to straddle, and you'll see in Muhlenberg's life, we had to straddle this very narrow line between being new immigrants in the country and wanting to be patriots, as the Muhlenberg family was, and at the same time being looked down upon by people no less than Ben Franklin as dirty, uneducated, too many children Germans. Does that sound familiar? People have always talked about immigrants in the same way, no matter who they are. In fact, where my seminary is in Philadelphia is in a place called Germantown. And you might think, oh, that's great, they named a town after us. No. Franklin and others banished the Germans due north out of Philadelphia to a place that they eventually called Germantown, because he not only wanted to convince people that the Germans were responsible, that the Lutherans were responsible for the smallpox epidemic that had hit Philadelphia, but if they all moved out of town, there would be a lot more available real estate. This is how we are a part of American history. There's a painting of Muhlenberg. I'm thinking of rocking that hair at some point. Or not. You probably recognize the old European preaching tab there around his neck. Muhlenberg settled ultimately in Trapp, Pennsylvania, which is just outside of the city of Philadelphia. You'll see his house there in the lower left, still standing. You can take tours. They are doing an archaeological dig around his house right now. One of the things we've discovered about Muhlenberg recently is that he wasn't just a pastor. He wasn't even just a merchant. He was the local druggist. They have found little ampules, little glass ampules outside of his house where people would come for medication. Now, he had a botanist's son, so that may have had something to do with it. But he wasn't just a pastor. He's pretty industrious. You know, he had a lot going on for him. So the upper left there is the inside of his house. Pretty typical colonial. We shouldn't forget that the Muhlenbergs, at least, they had some money. They had some means. That is not how your typical German Lutheran lived at the time. And then if you look at, that's Trapp Church on the very right. Looks like a barn. Why does it look like a barn? Yeah, because that's what people knew how to build. Right? So Trapp Church, again, is still standing. You can still go in there. When I was in seminary, we would have a worship service in there once a year. What you might find interesting about Trapp Church is that its official name is Augustus Lutheran Church. Do you know why it's called Augustus Lutheran Church? Because that's the German for Augsburg, right? Just like the Swedish is Augustana. Right. So there is a connection, right, between the Swedes of the time and the Germans of the time. The Lutherans were very, very centered on the Augsburg Confession. For the Swedes, they came here not even really about 100 years after Luther posted his theses. But for the Germans, Muhlenberg was from Luther's area. And so he was heavily, heavily influenced by the Augsburg, Augustana, Augustus tradition. This is considered the first Lutheran church in America. It's not. The ones that I showed you from Philly and Wilmington, but this is, religion's at least some part folklore. Muhlenberg's motto was Ecclesia Plantanda. So for you Latin scholars, that means? Plant churches, right. That was Muhlenberg's motto. The chapel that I served when I was at Muhlenberg College, in stone above the door as you left, not as you came in, as you left, was the words Ecclesia Plantanda. Go out and plant the churches. This is a Muhlenberg church. This is a Trinity. This is Trinity Lutheran Church in Reading, Pennsylvania. I mention it because Muhlenberg traveled all over the place. He traveled as far north as Maine and as far south as Georgia. There's a wonderful story when he was in New England. This is when he was a young man, not yet married. It was him and a horse. And he was, trying to do this tour, seeing what's going on, trying to understand what's happening with the churches. The snow was so deep, he wrote in his journals, that he would have to take a couple of steps, flatten the snow, and then bring the horse. Flatten the snow, bring the horse. That's a commitment to evangelism, right? One that most of us no longer have to be able to do that. So he traveled near and far. Reading is about an hour outside of Philadelphia. The reason I mention this is a couple of reasons. One is, when he was there, he met a man named Conrad Weiser. This is another place where Lutherans in the New World is a really important connection. So Muhlenberg's this German, he doesn't know what's going on. He meets Conrad Weiser, who's kind of a Davy Crockett type guy. He's trading with the local Native Americans, right? Eventually, Weiser marries one of Muhlenberg's daughters, okay? That's important because we cannot forget, a lot of this is going to be about boys. we cannot forget the influence that my phone has. Oh, it's Kurt Meyer. He's calling about next week. We cannot forget the influence that women had as Lutherans in the New World. One of Muhlenberg's other daughters ended up being the wife of the first governor. First? No. One of the early governors of Pennsylvania. So we had that kind of influence also. But the other thing about Trinity in Reading is Muhlenberg, in his planting churches, the first generation of planting was a church like this. It originally looked like this, and Weiser's Trading Post was just this way. Just a brick or a stone and wood building. Eventually, this stone and wood building is right here, and eventually it turned into this much larger colonial-looking building in the early 1800s. Trap church that I showed you looks just like this, just rougher. But this is that typical white, colonial style horseshoe, right? They gave that to us. The Swedes and the Germans, the Lutherans gave us this architecture. This church too, still standing, still active, still called Trinity. That's its altar up there. And then something just totally personal. Joanna and I were married right there. But we like the idea that this is a Muhlenberg church. This is one of the first Lutheran churches in the country. Trinity then planted, the second generation of Muhlenberg, planted about 8 or 9 churches in the city of Reading. So you can see how this goes. Much in the same way, at least as I've been told, that has happened around here. Right? You have kind of a mother church, and then it spreads. Just a quick picture of the journals. You can still see these. They're kind of scattered around the country. There's different, in his own hand. This was, I think of it as 18th century blogging. He was voracious about writing everything down. Let's move to Peter real quick. Take a moment to read this. I think it should be readable.
You're reading that?
How about if I read it to you? I'm a clergyman, it is true, but I am also a patriot, and my liberty is as dear to me as any man. On the eve of July 4th, we read this. Shall I hide behind my robes, sitting still at home while others spill their blood to protect my freedom? Heaven forbid! I am called by my country to its defense. The cause is just and noble. I am convinced it is my duty to obey that call, a duty I owe to my God and to my country. The Bible tells us there is a time for all things, and there is a time to preach and a time to pray. But the time for me to preach has passed away. There is a time to fight, and that time has come now. Now is the time to fight. Call for recruits. Sound the drums. For us as Lutherans, I would say, and I'm not kidding, this is about as important as the Apostles' Creed. This is a statement of faith that codifies, that moves America from Luther, from all of the theological background of Luther, to being activated in colonial society. I could speak to you for about 2 hours just about that. But the important points I want to make are this. First, my country. You can see that the Muhlenbergs have already identified, even though they've only been literally in the country 30 or so years, they've already identified that the soil of America is our soil. We're not Germans anymore. And he wouldn't have said German American. We belong here. And the second thing that he says is, you can balance the Bible and public service, which is a uniquely Lutheran thing to think. Many denominations say, oh, it's just all Bible. We should separate ourselves from this world and only serve Jesus. Other denominations say, well, we're just all about service in the community, but the faith stuff, the theology stuff, isn't as important. Peter Muhlenberg, in these words, and these are pretty accurate, we think, to his words, puts a flag in the ground and says, you can be faithful and serve your country. This grows right out of Luther's treatise on whether or not a soldier can be saved, which was a question in the 16th century that he addressed during the wars that were happening then. Peter Muhlenberg picks that up. Why is that important for us now? I don't think it could be any more important for us now. That Lutherans, that people of faith, people of goodwill, must also be involved in the civic life of our country. That we can claim, this is my country, and I'm coming to its defense, and I'm bringing my Bible and my brain and everything else with me. And that's a legacy of us, folks. That's our birthright from where we came from, theological at least. And then finally, this is the old famous story, have you heard it, where he was standing in the pulpit with his preaching robes, and he said this, and he whipped them open, and he was wearing his military uniform. This is down, he was preaching in Virginia at the time. Now, that might sound very bold and wonderful, and I will never do it. But what you need to know is, Peter was with Washington at Valley Forge. And he was a general. But in those days, the way you got to be a general is by the recruits you brought in. So Peter didn't want to be a private or a corporal. He wanted to be a general. Because generals have it better. Right? So he had to go kind of on a recruiting tour, like his father, up and down the East Coast, and try to muster people for the revolution, for the cause, and for the army. So that's him. Every state has one or two statues in the house, in the Capitol. One of the statues for Pennsylvania is Peter Muhlenberg. So again, anybody who goes through that hall of statues is going to be impacted by a Lutheran. It gets better. So here are these little huts. That's where the soldiers stayed at Valley Forge. These are reproductions at this point, but they're fairly historically accurate. I've been in them. Very unpleasant. It's no wonder why they mostly froze to death and got diseases in the winter at Valley Forge, because it was nasty. The one on the far right, that's George Washington's quarters. It's good to be the king. Ernst Muhlenberg, just real quick. Ernst was he was a scientist, also a pastor, but also a scientist, right? Again, merging that notion. Lutherans have never been afraid to blend faith and science. We've never been shy about putting those two together. That is critically important to the formation of this country, and critically important that we're proud of that. That we were one of the earliest to say, yeah, science is okay, and it can go with religion. He also discovered a wonderful bog turtle. But this is the guy. Peter gets a lot of attention because he was in the military, he was with Washington and all that. This is the guy, Frederick. And this is why. Frederick was the first Speaker of the House of Representatives in America. A Lutheran pastor was the first Speaker of the House. And the third Speaker of the House, actually. So if you know anything about your history, it was the Speaker of the House who was the first signer of the Bill of Rights. Your Lutheran ancestor was the first signer of the Bill of Rights. But more than that, he, like his father and his brother, had to do some traveling. Frederick, with others, had to travel throughout the colonies selling the Bill of Rights. Because not everybody was thrilled about it. Not everybody agreed on all that stuff. But think about it. And he couldn't even call people. He had to go to them. Again, we cannot underestimate the influence of our Lutheran church, of our Lutheran theology, of our Lutheran way of life. How it directly affects our everyday life in this country. Because in selling the Bill of Rights, right? Think about it. Why do we have freedom of religion? Because a Lutheran pastor thought it was important. Among others. But you see the connection now? He was wise enough not to say, well, we're just going to be Catholics like Maryland, or we're just going to be Unitarians, like Massachusetts. No, we're going to open space for all people, for all religions. And guess what? That's a Lutheran idea. Sponsored and sold by a Lutheran pastor. Just let that sink in. So on July 4th, when we talk about the Declaration of Independence, and we think about all this important stuff in our colonial and present history, I hope you'll think now, wow, who we are is woven so much more tightly into that than you might have ever thought. So then as it went forward, you see the Lutherans starting to move, okay? Pennsylvania into Ohio, a little bit. Not quite here yet. This is the early 19th century. This church here was built in 1823. Very, very typical of the style, right? You see a little bit of that Swedish influence, right, that you saw in Philly and in Wilmington. But this was very typical. There were just literally hundreds of these, all up and down the East Coast. With the cemetery, very modest church. I know this was my first call. Yeah, that was my first call in the cemetery. We had Revolutionary War dead in our cemetery, and Civil War dead, right? So they started to move. This is early 19th century, but then they keep moving. And this is where it gets really interesting. This is going to be hard to see, but you can see East Coast, right, in America over here, right? So this is 1850 to 1870. Got it? So that's just after that church I showed you. Now we move. Now we're on the move, right? 1890 to 1916. That heyday of Swedes, right, that we talked about. This is after the Great Migration of Scandinavians in the 1850s and 60s, right? So now we're coming in, turn of the 20th century. We're on the move. But where are we on the move to? Pretty much one place. Yeah. Now, what might be called the heyday of American religion. Right? We're just on the eve of the Depression, and then we're through the post-war into the baby boomers. Right? This was, as we look back, this was about as good as it gets for Lutherans in America, in terms of numbers. Right? It's about as good as it gets. We're in the darkest places, we're 10% of the population. So think about that. While we are very, as the old joke says, in the upper Midwest, Lutherans are very dense. What we also know that at the height of American Lutheranism, we were barely 10% of the population. 90% of the population was something else. Now, for a lot of us, we would say, oh my God, I grew up Lutheran, it seemed like more. Well, of course you did. Because everyone in your school, and everyone in your Sunday school, and everyone at church was a Lutheran. Right? So of course it makes sense. Now by 1990, right? We know that things are, starting to crest and starting to decline, but we're still holding our own, right? A little bit less in the east. Those Germans that went down to Texas, they're still hanging in there. But we're still pretty much, right? Now look what's happened by 2010.
Shrunk.
We're shrinking. We've virtually lost the East. We've almost lost Texas. That's all right. They want to leave anyway. And then we've got, then we've got still the upper Midwest. But look at this next one. This one's easier to see. This is 1850, where we started. And this is 2010, where we ended. So we've made, which one do you want to read? This is 1850.
The colors.
Oh, yeah, well there's no color here, so. But the colors over here, we're still good in red, right? Illinois is running away, but we're hanging in there. What do you find, well, what do you see between 1850 and 2010? 160 years. What do you see? Well, we certainly moved westward, with everybody, So our faith was on the move, What else?
It went north.
Much of it went north,
Which is funny.
All the way to the West Coast.
We went all the way to the end. Some of the Swedes were brave enough to come way out here. If you've ever been to that part of the country, you know that there's a reason why we have a Lutheran college up there. If I were to overlay all the Lutheran colleges, it would almost match the population density. And those colleges were all founded 100 years or plus ago. You know how they say the more things change, the more they stay the same? That's the story of us Lutherans in the United States. Okay? We've changed. The country has changed in 160 years. But for the most part, we're still here. Right? We have not. I mean, look at this. Right? If this was a Southern Baptist map, right? Just turn it over. Right? Which will tell you how important it is to never forget how still in 2019, how still religions are bound by geography and ethnicity. How that's still a huge deal. Despite in the larger culture how we've tried to become more diverse, and more accepting of people, religions still are so parochial. For better or worse. We can debate that. So where do we go from here? What do you take from what you've seen so far? What are your conclusions, or your thoughts, your ideas?
We still need to plant churches.
There is that.
How do
Right.
we grow?
What's that?
How do we grow?
Okay. Yeah, how do we grow? What?
The ELCA is focused on becoming a diverse population. In other words, reach out beyond Swedes and Norwegians and
Right.
Germans. It looks like we're pushing sand uphill to make that happen.
We are.
The data seems to
Pushing
indicate
what?
it's easier to grow
Pushing
your
sand
own.
uphill.
Exactly right. Grow your own, pushing sand uphill. I think one of the takeaways is we all, we talk about, oh, the church is shrinking, or the church is this, or it's getting older, or whatever. Some of that is just frankly natural life cycle of how this stuff works. Right? In the 30 years of the ELCA, we had set a goal to become a certain number, as Russ was referring to, a certain number of people whose language is other than English and non-white. We had set those diversity goals. In the 30 years since we've been in the ELCA, we've actually gone backwards. We're actually less diverse than we were 30 years ago. While the larger culture has gone in the completely opposite direction. So, next time I present, we'll talk about that. But, as I can't stress enough this ecclesia plantanda. The two things that what else? And then I'll finish up with the two things I would like to think about. What else do you take away from this?
The Muhlenbergs, they were all that.
They were. And even if you live out east, you don't even learn about them in confirmation. Unless somebody takes a kind of particular interest in this kind of stuff. For the most part, we don't know our own history, which is disappointing. Because there are people like the Muhlenbergs here, who came to the Midwest. Well, you all know the names. I don't know the names. The people who founded Augustana, the Esbjorn, right? I mean, those people exist, but we fail to remember them and their contributions and then make the connection as to why they're important. I mean, Augustana, not just the school, but the synod, has a wonderful sort of social ministry, social justice kind of history, that comes from the Swedes. They're not all just socialists, like we think of them now. They had a very, very informed theology of service. That's a good thing. Our kids should know about those things and why it's important. What else? Yeah?
I have a question. Where were mistakes made? Can you see any places where had something turned another way, it would have been different and better?
I think the mistakes on the church's part were at least two. One, I think in the 30s and the 40s, three. In the 30s and the 40s, I think, especially those Germans, but I know there was some Swedes and Norwegians who did it too, you had some pastors who were just so rigid. Do you know what I'm talking about? So stiff that it really turned off a lot of people. They couldn't separate themselves from the theology. Many of them thought they were Jesus, or had that kind of power. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I think we should not underestimate, whether it was conscious or unconscious, how we Lutherans still are trying to reconcile how we let it happen in Germany in World War II. The churches were virtually silent. And I think you cannot understand how, I think we still struggle to understand how such a proud theological tradition that speaks in its documents so strongly against stuff like that. And yet, German Lutherans, and in fact the Nazis used some German, Lutheran theology. I think we can't underestimate how we're still working through that. And then in the 60s, American Christian Protestant churches really had two options. They were going to go evangelical, right? Which then kind of had its birth in the early 70s. Or, so more conservative, more evangelical. Or go the way that we kind of went, which was we're just going to rise above it and kind of go into our heads. So we have incredible Lutheran theologians in the 50s and 60s and the 70s. People doing remarkable, Karl Barth, the remarkable work theologically. But for the most part, we pull back. If anything, when we got engaged in society, we were more social justice, women's movement, women's ordination, all good things. but I think the culture disconnected from us because we were neither the emotional religion of evangelicalism, nor were we, if you wanted boundaries and structure, you were a Catholic. And we kind of pulled back from all of that and just sort of waited to see and didn't assert ourselves. And I think with those three things, and there's probably more, the larger culture, we became a bit irrelevant. We were still relevant in terms of our own groups. You know, we still had St. Lucia fests and things like that. But we ceased to be relevant to the larger culture when we had a moment, an opportunity, when we could have become more relevant and not less. And I worry that we just never really recovered from that. We have an opportunity now, I think, but we never really recovered. Anything else? Yeah, right.
Do you want to discuss briefly the ELCA and the LCMS, or the WELS, and their differences? And I trust all those maps include all Lutherans.
Yeah.
And if you really wanted to have an accurate map, you've had red and green, or red and blue.
Sure. So Lutherans, remember about 10 years ago when we were arguing about gay people?
Yeah.
Okay, remember 10 years before that when we were arguing about Episcopalians? Right? You remember Episcopalians? We were like, oh no, we don't want to get together with them because it'll screw up our apostolic succession and all that. Ugh. That's our history. That's not an aberration. That's who we are. If I had more time, I would spend more time in the 19th century when we were fracturing and getting back together and fracturing and getting back together. The Lutheran Church in the United States could also be characterized as a really bad marriage, where we like fight and then we say, oh honey, I'm sorry, forgive me, and then we fight some more, and just this kind of codependent, crazy relationship. We have the two primary reasons why we had as many synods as we had, and I don't mean within the ELCA, those are geographic synods. I mean, things like Augustana, that synod, is either around language and ethnicity or some theological disagreement. Let me give you an example. Peter Muhlenberg was one of the first advocates for English in the liturgy, way back in 1803. That Trinity Lutheran Church that I showed you, they had a split not long after that. Because their belief was, and I know you're familiar with this, some thought that God spoke English. Others believed without a doubt that God spoke German. Right? So you have to pray in German so God hears your prayers. Right? So here's what happened. A bunch of people from the congregation got up and went and founded their own church. Literally, if this is Trinity Reading, on that corner. Okay? Literally on the other side of the parking lot. Built their own building, built their own church, and to this day, still have services in German. To this day. Okay? That's our history. That's who we are. That's the downside of our history. Okay? We're factious. We break apart for lots of different reasons. Right? People, Norwegians and Swedes say, okay, I might go to your church, but Norwegians and Swedes can agree we would never go to a Finnish church. Right? That's just who we are. So the downside of those maps that I showed you is, yeah, we are concentrated in certain places because of geography and ethnicity. But the good news is, and why I didn't worry about the Episcopalian thing, and I didn't worry about the gay and lesbian stuff, and I continue not to worry about the arguments that we have, because this church has always found a way to make it work. We disagree mightily. The Missouri Synod, the Wisconsin Synod, Lutheran Brethren, there are, I think, something like 27 different kinds of Lutherans. We're the biggest. Woo! But we have always found a way. Because we have always held at the center of who we are, one Lord, one faith, one baptism. And that binds us together. So one of the things I think in terms of turning this whole thing around is to get out in front of this and tell people that that's the church we are. We're a big tent around one Lord, one faith, one baptism. That's one thing. The second thing I would suggest to you is, as Val said, we need to plant churches, but we don't need to build any more buildings. That's an important, right? When our colonial ancestors got here, planting a church, a physical church, said, we're here. We're not leaving. You know, once you put grandma in the cemetery yard, we're not leaving grandma. Okay? You know, we're not moving. You know, the church, that first church that I served, there were literally, I could put my hand outside the window and touch tombstones. Well, they're not going anywhere. You can't pick up all those people, right? But I think we can plant churches. I listened to a podcast yesterday, an ELCA church that is completely digital. They don't have a building, they don't gather, they're a national congregation, they are on Twitter, that's how they meet regularly, right? That's a church. You might not think so, but where two or more are gathered, there also am I. Are they able to share the sacraments? Not sure how they do that, right? But they're trying something. They're planting something that they're trying to make work. We can plant congregations inside congregations. We could be union congregations again. You know, and who knows, you know, these guys, the Methodists over here, maybe someday we'll be the same congregation. I don't know.
I think the Methodists down here can come share this building. They're on the bottom of going out of business.
Yeah, and so we have to be open to the idea that our at least our American founder said that's what's going to make this happen. That we plant congregations, really. And then the third thing I would say that is absolutely critical, and maybe more than anything, a younger generation, and not just younger, I think some of us too, a younger generation is crying, calling out for the church to wake up and be the church. What have you seen from the Christian church, capital C, at the border, where children are being jammed into cages? Where's the church? Where are we? Peter Muhlenberg said, I cannot shake my duty to my country. We have a duty to our country. Now, it might be something different for all of you. You know? Not everybody is called to do this or that or the other thing. That's okay. But a younger generation, or I should say a younger thinking generation in some cases, because I think I've met lots of people who are in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s who are asking the same question. If we learn anything from our Lutheran ancestors, it ought to be grow where you're planted. Grow where you're planted. Act. Be a force for good. In your neighborhood, in your city, in your region, whatever it might be, make the church relevant again. We should stand for something. And if it isn't getting kids out of cages, I'm not sure what it is. So, you know, I appreciate your time today. I would love to have this conversation more and more and more. But like I said, the title of this talk was a little bit of a trick. The title of this talk was a bit of a trick. And the reason it was a trick is that Lutherans in the New World then is not really any different than Lutherans in the new world we're living in. And I think what we can learn from these folks could help. Will we ever get a strong foothold in Arkansas? I doubt it. But there is plenty of work in the Quad Cities for Lutherans to claim our birthright. So, thanks.